Hello, friends and insiders. This is Government Unfiltered. I'm Dan Williams. Although the 2020 elections are still months away, I've heard concerns just how long the COVID-19 pandemic could impact our lives. Could it actually impact the presidential election? The fact is, in the history of our country, there's never been an emergency that changed the date of our presidential elections. But could the president simply cancel the election as a way to remain the president? If he doesn't have the power to change the date of the elections, then who does? If an emergency keeps us from voting in November, or a date before President Trump is set to leave office, would he continue to be president, or would someone else have to take over? As we'll hear in today's episode, both the 12th Amendment and the 20th Amendment of the Constitution hold many of the answers to these questions. Information in this episode comes from a March 20, 2020 brief from the Congressional Research Service. It provides an overview of the presidential elections by looking at the laws surrounding presidential primaries, the process of the selection of presidential electors, and ultimately the selection of the president. This is the report. Postponing federal elections and the COVID-19 pandemic. Legal considerations. On March 13, 2020, Louisiana's governor invoked emergency powers to announce that the state's presidential primary election, previously scheduled for April 4, would be postponed for more than 2 months as part of the state's response to the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, also known as COVID-19. Other states soon began exploring similar changes, prompting election officials, candidates, and voters to prepare for disruptions that could persist through November's general election. In today's podcast, we're going to review the legal provisions that would constrain any efforts to delay or cancel federal elections during a public health crisis or other national emergency, with the focus on the presidential elections. Presidential selection and secession is best understood as a 3-step process, consisting of 1, the nomination of candidates by political parties, 2, the appointment of electors, and 3, balloting by electors and, if necessary, the House of Representatives. Each step in this process is governed by a different constellation of state, federal, and constitutional rules, which allocate or foreclose discretion to alter the schedule to different actors. The first step is presidential primaries. The Constitution makes no mention of the primary elections that the major parties have adopted in most states to select delegates to the national conventions, where presidential candidates are formally nominated. Accordingly, it is largely the state's prerogative, in coordination with the political parties, to set the schedule and the method of these contests. Some states schedule presidential primaries according to parochial interests. New Hampshire law, for example, requires that state's presidential primary to be held at least 7 days in advance of any other state's primary to preserve its first-in-the-nation status. Other states defer to the parties. In South Carolina, state law provides that a political party may set the date and hours that polls will be open for a presidential preference primary election by providing written notice to the State Election Commission at least 90 days before the preferred date. In other states, a party may choose to forego holding primary elections altogether. If a party does choose to hold a presidential primary, state law may allocate the powers and procedures for modifying, postponing, or canceling the election during an emergency. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, at least 45 states have laws that address election day emergencies. In some states, the governor is explicitly granted the power by statute to delay or reschedule an election during an emergency. Other states vest special powers in the state's chief election official. Where state emergency laws are silent or ambiguous about the authority to postpone elections, courts may be asked to settle disputes. On the eve of Ohio's 2020 presidential primary, after the state's governor concluded he lacked emergency authority to postpone the election in response to COVID-19 concerns, a local state court refused to delay the election on its own authority. The state's Department of Health director then ordered the closing of all polling locations under the authority of a law permitting her to make special orders for preventing the spread of contagious or infection diseases. In response, Ohio's Secretary of State rescheduled the primary for June 2, which has sparked a new round of litigation as plaintiffs argue that only the state's legislature can set an election date. In some cases, states have adopted other mechanisms to protect the legitimacy of elections that may have been disrupted by a disaster. In New York, for example, if an emergency causes less than 25% of registered voters to vote during an election, a second day of voting is to be held not more than 20 days after the original date. States may also act through the regular legislative process during an emergency to reschedule an election or enlarge the governor's powers. Moving on to the second step, selection of presidential electors. Similar to its silence about presidential primary elections, the Constitution does not require a general election for president. While representatives and senators must be elected by the people, the Constitution provides that the president is chosen by electors, appointed at the direction of each state's legislature. Thus, while every state currently chooses its electors through popular election, where votes cast for presidential candidates are counted as votes for the electors pledged to those candidates, a state legislature could decide to select electors itself if the determined elections were infeasible. Indeed, it was common for legislatures to select electors without popular elections until the mid-1800s. Whatever method a state chooses, the Constitution empowers Congress to set the date by which states must choose their electors. Since 1845, Congress has required states to appoint presidential electors on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which represents the date by which voters in every state must cast their ballot for president. However, the statute does contemplate that some states may not be able to comply with this deadline. By law, quote, whenever any state has held an election for the purpose of choosing electors, unquote, but fails to, quote, make a choice on the day prescribed by law, unquote, the state legislature may establish the manner for appointing electors on a subsequent date. It is not clear whether Congress intended the same flexibility to occur when a state was unable to hold its scheduled election. Unlike the practice of some states that allow the governor to postpone an election during emergencies, neither the Constitution nor Congress provides any similar power to the president or federal officials to change this date outside of Congress's regular legislative process. Congress has enacted more than 100 statutes identifying special powers that the president may exercise during a national emergency, but none include the power to postpone or cancel any state's chosen method of appointing presidential electors. During previous episodes of war, pandemic, or other deadly crises in American history, the presidential election date has never been changed in response to an emergency. And now that moves us to step 3, selection of the president. The Constitution empowers Congress to determine the date the electors will cast their vote for president from their home states. Consistent with that authority, Congress has directed electors to submit their votes on, quote, the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, unquote. Only Congress may change this date by enacting a new statute. Anticipating that there may occasionally be delays, federal law instructs officials to send urgent requests to states that have not submitted their electors' votes by the fourth Wednesday in December. Congress has provided that the electors' votes are to be tabulated on the sixth day of January, though occasionally it has chosen other dates in early January. To be elected president, a candidate must receive votes from a majority of the appointed electors. If no candidate receives this majority, whether because the vote is divided among multiple candidates, or because a decisive number of electors were not able to submit their votes in time, the 12th Amendment requires the contest to be decided by the House of Representatives. Each state delegation casts one vote. Members from at least 2/3 of the states must participate for there to be a quorum, and a winner must receive votes from a majority of all states. The Constitution provides that each term for members of Congress expires on the third day of January. Thus, in the event of a catastrophic emergency that prevented a significant number of states from transmitting the votes of electors and from holding congressional elections, there could be no body on the prescribed day of January 6th to choose the new president. In such a scenario, the duty could fall to the Senate. As a quote-unquote continuing body, 2/3 of the Senate's members remain in office even if elections do not occur in a given year. Under the 12th Amendment, the Senate may choose the vice president-elect. If the House of Representatives is not able to choose a president, then the vice president-elect assumes that office. Under the 20th Amendment, the incumbent president's term ends at noon on January 20th. There are no provisions of law permitting a president to stay in office after this date, even in the event of a national emergency, short of the ratification of a new constitutional amendment. If none of the other avenues for selecting a new president have been successful, the vacancy would be filled according to the prescribed rules of succession. If there is neither a president nor vice president to discharge the powers and duties of the office of president, then the Speaker of the House of Representatives shall act as president. If there is no speaker, or if the speaker otherwise fails to qualify as acting president, the president pro tempore of the Senate shall act as president. That concludes today's episode on postponing federal elections and the COVID-19 pandemic. After seeing this question come up in media reports and seeing questions on social media, this was a topic that interested me. So hopefully this episode has helped to answer the question of whether or not the president is able to cancel or postpone an election. As we just learned, Congress would have to vote to provide the president with that power. It was also interesting to learn that an emergency situation has never come up that has changed the date for the presidential election. If I'm understanding this correctly, and somehow we aren't able to have an election and find ourselves in a scenario where it comes down to the remaining members of the Senate to choose a vice president-elect, to then assume the duties of president, there are 65 senators who would remain in office to make that vote. 33 are Democrats, 2 are independents who caucus with the Democrats, and the remaining 30 are Republican. So in this case, it would be expected that the majority would choose a Democrat as vice president. But as of today, it seems unlikely that we would even get to that point. But it is interesting to know that all of these are scenarios that have been considered and that there's a framework in place to handle these scenarios. If you enjoyed today's episode, Government Unfiltered is created using the value for value model. I put together the episodes, and you can decide what it's worth. Most podcasts are produced with the idea of finding advertisers, but this is not one of those podcasts. My commitment is to our friends of the show, who help this podcast remain ad-free. So you can decide through your contribution if you want the show to continue. Help me continue to do work like this by supporting the show on a monthly basis at insiderfriends.com. If you do, I want to be sure to give you credit on an upcoming episode. If you'd prefer to support the show with a one-time donation, you can go to governmentunfiltered.com, or you can support anonymously on a one-time or recurring basis at glow.fm/insider. Stay tuned, please share the show with friends, and thank you for listening.